signature of this meeting, I think, has been the vision that chefs and scientists have enough to talk about together, that they can actually enrich their own experience, like whether it's experiments that could be done in the lab, inspired by the knowledge of the chefs, or vice versa, that like our understanding of how the brain or our senses function could really have designed like, new effects in the kitchen at the dining table. And I think Heston highlighted like the importance of his interactions with the scientists, like in terms of the tools that he used in the kitchen, but also inspiration. He mentioned Charles Spencer, who is going to contribute to this session. And here, what we have, like in terms of this close interaction, this synergy between a chef and a scientist, we have like one perfect example. So it's Joseph Youssef, who's going to start. He's the co-founder of The Kitchen Theory, which is a company, restaurant as well. He's been working in close collaboration with Charles Spencer, who is a professor at Oxford University. And I hope that you will find the result of this dialogue a source of inspiration for the future. That's it.
So, molecular gastronomy is dead. That's what we heard this morning. Maybe we just rebrand it as modernist cuisine, and that would be fine. It would be kind of the science of the kitchen, the science of new tools, new ingredients, new means of preparation. And that's taken us a long way over the last 3 decades or so. But what comes next? One hears talk of things like neurogastronomy, kind of the brain on flavor. Or one might think brainy tongue meeting. That would be kind of the perfect title for this interaction between food science and brain science. And here I think one thing that the neurogastronomy can miss out on is the effect of context. That in fact, the isolated subject inserted in a brain scanner with a tube in their mouth will tell you something about how flavor is processed, important things about the impact of labeling and branding. But what it misses is the social interactions, the dynamics at the table and with the service staff and in the environment in which we eat and drink. So we think we kind of need something a little bit different to try and take the science from the kitchen, where it's done so well, and apply it to the restaurant setting. And for that, we think maybe something like gastrophysics might be a useful term or moniker for this combination of gastronomic science and the psychophysics, the gastronomy on that side of the room, and the psychophysics on this side. And by psychophysics, we kind of mean this sort of systematic, as far as we can, study of human perception and behavior when we throw a range of inputs at the observer and try and see what kind of patterns of output come as a result.
So, can we go on to the next one? Sorry. So, at Kitchen Theory, I get asked an awful lot when I go around, and if I got a penny for every time someone asked me, where's your restaurant, I would be very, very rich at this point. We're not a restaurant. We're started off calling ourselves an experimental kitchen, but then that seemed very limited in a way, because there seemed to be so much more we were doing outside of just the kitchen. Kind of had a connotation of everything was kind of experimenting in a culinary sense, and we wanted to broaden this. So we now call ourselves a multi-sensory gastronomy experience design studio, and I promise you all, as I've said this over the last couple of days, we're trying desperately to reduce that down into something slightly that runs off the tongue slightly easier, but it does kind of capture the essence of what we do at Kitchen Theory. So there's very much the focus on the multisensory, and that's what we're going to talk to you about today, and it's really looking at, Bernard had mentioned the idea of flavor being a composition of taste, smell, aroma, and texture, and I think what we're really looking to do is broaden that definition to incorporate all of our senses, and looking at the impact that all of our senses have when we, in our perception, the associations that we have with food, and the relationship, ultimately, that we have with food. So that is kind of like the main driver, where a lot of the ideas that inspire the dishes and inspire our work come from, is the research that we do with Professor Spence. And then that leads into the gastronomy part. But again, when I talk about gastronomy, the definition, I guess, that I go by is kind of Brillat-Savarin's definition of everything that relates to man as a feeding animal. So not just taking gastronomy as being something that's very top-level, fine dining, kind of when gastronomy has kind of become, as a term, maybe has become associated with that type of or level of cuisine, but we're looking at it in a much kind of more democratized way. And then, so finding gastronomic applications for the multisensory research that we do, and then finding ways of bringing these into experiences that we design for our diners or for the clients that we work with. So, over the last few years, we've developed loads of different types of menus. I'm kind of one of those people where I get distracted easily by kind of shiny objects, I guess. So when I see, you know, all of a sudden I could be having a conversation with someone about a topic, and then I'll become quite focused on that for several days, weeks, or months. And as a result, we've ended up doing everything from Japanese cuisine with keiseki, Mexican cuisine with Mexico, Natura, which was our Nordic cuisine menu. But when I talk about these, we're not actually trying to recreate dishes from those cultures. What we're really trying to do is understand the fundamental principles of what defines those cuisines, and then, because we're based in London, so with keiseki, you think one of the kind of main principles of keiseki has to be that the food is local and seasonal, and that's a huge part of of the idea behind keiseki. And it would seem counterintuitive then for me as a chef in London to be importing the ingredients from halfway across the world to do a menu where it's all about locality and seasonality. So we use British ingredients, but it's more the cultural aspects, the techniques, the philosophies, and the ideas, the cultural ideas, but what drives these cuisines and defines them, and we try and capture those elements and then reproduce them in our way, because if you want Japanese food, I'm sure there are better Japanese chefs than me, but it's our interpretations. And then the other concepts have focused on things like gastrophysics, which is the current concept that we have on at the moment, and in the past, synesthesia. And what we really wanted to do was educate our diners, because a lot of people hadn't really, and I think Heston had mentioned that he's a synesthete, and I think a lot of people, especially the people that came to the dinner, really didn't have an idea what synesthesia was about. And we wanted to teach them about, or educate them on what synesthesia was, and we thought the best way of doing this would be to give them, in a way, their own kind of synesthetic experiences, but at least give them an idea on the correlations of, or the cross-modal talk or chatter that they have in their brain, and we're going to try this out with you. So we developed on the research that Professor Spence had done several years ago. He had looked at color and taste associations. So just a quick show of hands. Do we think that tastes have colors or colors have tastes? Okay. We're still in a minority, which is quite good. That works well for me at this point. So I thought, okay, well, how, you know, maybe if we want to teach people about synesthesia, if we could start with something simple like drawing a connection between color and taste, that might be a great way of people then going away and and kind of understanding that some people have correlations between things like sound and taste, or smell and sound, and these kind of connections. So we thought this would be a nice one to start with. So our amuse-bouche was called the Four Tastes. And you should have kind of almost like a recreated kind of sample of this. You should have 4 jellies in front of you, and what we would ask the diners to do when they joined us, they would get them in this sequence as you see here, and what we would then ask them to do, and this is what I'm going to ask you to do now, is rearrange them into the order based on, you can lick the jelly if you want, but we're kind of really focused on just vision and taste here. So what I'd like you to do is, just by looking at the color of the jellies, arrange them into the order that you believe is salty, followed by bitter, sour, sweet. So that's salty, bitter, sour, sweet. If you could arrange them into that order in the next 15 seconds or so. Now, you may say how they've been presented, you may follow this order, or you may think it's a different order, but this is very much a perceptual notion. Maybe if we go for a kind of, just by process of elimination, a kind of quick show of hands. So salty, we started out with that be, can we have a show of hands for red for salty? Okay. Green for salty? Black for salty? White for salty. Clear majority on the white. Cool. Not that saying that you're right, but that's saying that that's your perception. and I think you'll get to why. But, so let's say then we had salty, bitter. So now we've eliminated, so bitter being red, bitter being green, bitter being black. Good. So then we come up to sour. Sour, now we've got red and green. Sour being red, sour being green. Good. And then we're left with red as being sweet.
And please enjoy your...
Oh, yeah, please
your
enjoy.
jellies.
Yeah, do try and either confirm or disconfirm.
Of course, if it confirms your expectations, you're more likely to enjoy the taste of the jelly, whereas if you get something you weren't expecting to taste, that can be a shocking experience in the wrong hands, in the wrong place. So hopefully your eyes have led you in the right direction. This kind of comes back to a question from 200 years ago on the kind of most famous of psychologists, Ferdinand von Helmholtz, amongst others, have been telling us that colors do not have tastes. They can't, they're separate sensory inputs. And yet there is a certain affinity, a certain association, a certain correspondence between colors and tastes, but also between colors and flavors, aromas as well. And the idea from this sort of collaboration is starting from the lab, you can crowdsource data, ask hundreds or thousands of people in one country or another or across the world what associations, what color comes to mind when they think of a taste, and then engineer that into a dish like the 4 tastes that Joseph served, that has the diners mindful about their food, rearranging the elements, and it often generates a discussion, I think, between the diners. Well, why did I think that way and you put them in a different order? Who's right?
That's the best part of it.
Is anyone right? Well, no one is right, but there's a certain kind of concordance amongst people that's interesting that can be built into design. We've then taken those dish you just saw, thrown it on the internet, and over a matter of hours or days, we can get hundreds or thousands of people and find out that the results from informal settings like this are matched at the larger scale. And then also sort of take that dish around the world to different countries, perhaps coordinating it for different markets and different color, taste associations. But what kind of comes back to the sort of science side is when we think about color and taste, we just put pure hues up there and never think about the opacity of the color. Whereas when the chef creates something, sometimes it's a clear green sphere, sometimes it's a cloudy one. And that difference between clear and cloudy can sometimes change the associations you have. You will not find that in the scientific literature on color and taste, but it comes out of the collaboration, I think, and then leads into a new round of research. I'm very interested in the colors of tastes, of flavors, and how to change taste and flavor expectations, and then taste and flavor perception as a result by changing the colors of foods. But I think there's interest in the area of color goes much wider than that to the color of the plate, to the color of the environment in which you are sitting. And I'll just give us one example of what's kind of an exploding area of research now between the science and gastronomy is something like this from work with the Alicia Foundation for an Adria's Research Center, serving a red strawberry frozen dessert from either a black or a white plate, in this case both round, and having people in the dining setting having to evaluate the taste, how sweet is that ice cream, how flavorful is it, and maybe how much would you pay or how much do you like that dessert. Different people, but all on the same day in the same venue with the same batch of ice cream, and yet we find that those who are served from the white plate will rate the ice cream as tasting 10% sweeter, 15% more flavorful as a result of the plate. So plates cannot literally have taste, and yet they can influence and modify the tastes of foods. Done here first in the restaurant, and this kind of experiment on the color and shape of plateware is now going around a number of culinary schools and research centers around the world. But it can also be uploaded into online studies of flavor expectations, and so kind of massify the data and not require that you always test real diners eating real foods in naturalistic situations, because that's going to be kind of hard, effortful, costly, and difficult to implement. And just as mentioned in the beginning, that sort of the interest is not just on high-end gastronomy, but the idea is that maybe some of these, hopefully some of the interactions that are happening in high-end cuisine can be spun out or used to deliver insights that can be applicable to a much wider setting to everyone, no matter where they eat and however fortunate or unfortunate they may be. And I'll just give this as a case in point of kind of a new direction. Now that we know how important plate color is to perception and to consumption behavior, one might think about all those patients, the elderly, the infirm, in care homes and in hospitals who are clinically underfed, not getting enough nutrients, and hence having their hospital stays prolonged, and this is a nice preliminary study from a hospital in the south of England, showing that simply by changing the colour of the plate in the hospital, average consumption in these underfed individuals went up by about 30%. Significant impact, simple intervention. And you kind of think, well, maybe would it ever have happened in the hospital if it hadn't happened first in the restaurant? Maybe. It's just harder to do the research to get the ethics and the approval in the hospital, and that's kind of the approach that we want to take. And also, I guess, there's kind of we've heard in the last couple of days about the potential impact of technology, not just in the kitchen, but in the front of house, in the way that we all interact with, order, purchase, and evaluate the foods that we eat, wherever we eat them. And this is one of the examples of sort of prototype with Katsuo Okajima, working with a commercially available headset, thinking about changing the visual appearance of foods. So these come in at about 1,000 euros or dollars a piece. You can use it to watch your movies, and then you can put the headset on, and you see the real sushi on the left, what the diner sees from the headset on the right, and how simply by moving their hand over the sushi, we can change the visual appearance properties of the food. Not just changing red for green, but actually getting all the textural cues, a very difficult kind of texture to render, and that can be done here. Or one might think, how might that interface with the foods of the future? When the seas are fished to extinction of certain varieties, might this help? And will our understanding of visual dominance, how often what we see sets our expectations and then changes our flavour perception? Maybe we'll need to know about the brain science in order to interpret these results and how best to use them in the dining setting, or maybe it's in entertainment or theatrics. The final example of sort of technology at table, again, illustrates, I think, this sort of back and forth between the science lab to the kitchen and then back to the science lab, and sometimes in a kind of iterative loop, comes from a dish that was served at the House of Wolf restaurant in London, now closed down, a venue where Joseph, I first met him a number of years ago, and they did a culinary artist, Caroline Hopkinson, developed a sensory menu, one course for each sense, blindfolding, earplugs, eating without your hands, a whole range of sensory entertainment. But the most interesting thing for us was the sound course at the end, and this dish kind of came out of collaboration with the Fat Duck Research Kitchens down in Bray and Condiment Junkie, a sound design agency. You can see here we've got a bittersweet sonic cake pop, and the instructions on the menu are for diners to take out their mobile device and to dial 0845 680 2419 if you want to make your dessert more bitter. Take your mobile device out and sonically season your food by dialing a different number to hear a different soundscape if you want to make your dessert sweeter instead. Now here we've got a diner in the restaurant setting with their own technology, these supercomputers in our pockets, as we heard earlier, eating a bittersweet chocolate lolly and listening to a sound that, is that the sweet seasoning or is it the bitter seasoning? Here's one soundscape. The other sound that you might hear is this. And when we test this in Bray, when we test this in the lab in Oxford, when we test this online, or when we test it in a restaurant setting, the majority of people will say this sounds sweeter. So not only do colours have tastes, but tastes also have sonic properties associated, demonstrated first in the food research kitchen at the Fat Duck, then in the restaurant setting, and then back into the lab and out into the real world with airlines like British Airways launching their Soundbite menu in 2014, where you order something on the plane and then you can plug into the headset and choose a soundtrack to match and hopefully enhance the taste of that food.
And we've found kind of several ways of applying this idea, and we've had very, very interesting results. So in the middle there and on the side, you can see, so we conduct something with corporate clients called Senseplorations, and the idea behind these is has become kind of quite a new term in the last couple of years, and it's about taking a product, in this case it was with Chivas Regal, and looking at how sensory properties would augment people's perception of the flavor. One of the things that we were looking at was how can we kind of introduce whiskey to kind of novice drinkers, how can we get them to kind of appreciate it. We found the number one most important element was the shape of the glass. The weight and shape and texture of the glass that you're holding had a huge impact on people's perception of the flavor. Then kind of followed by that, it was olfactory aroma, kind of any olfactory stimulation, orthonasal. So spraying something like caramel or butterscotch just before you take a sip of whiskey enhances the sweetness and brings out kind of the vanilla and the sweet tones. And we know if you're a novice whiskey drinker, you ask a lot of people who are kind of maybe haven't drunk too much of it or want to understand more about it. When you ask them what they like about whiskey, it tends to be the sweeter notes. So we know that if you have a kind of sweet aroma in the room, that will kind of bring out what they really like in it. And what we found really surprising was the third kind of element that seemed to have a huge impact was sound. And we found that by playing 2 different tracks, we knew that this worked, this idea, but we were really surprised by the kind of impact that it had on people, and that the what we called a bitter track actually brought out the kind of oaky, aged kind of notes, the smokier kind of notes, and some people really appreciate that. And then the sweet track that we had kind of brought out more of the floral and the sweeter notes and aromas and tastes that you have in there. So it's very interesting to kind of see how you can take all these insights and apply them to pretty much any product and see what we're not trying to do, and this is very important. We had a bit of a discussion about this yesterday, or I had with someone, which is, as chefs, I guess we're very sensitive to the word manipulation, because I guess there's always that connotation of trying to take day-old fish or a couple of day-old fish and set it off as being fresher than it is. That's really not what we're trying to get to. Here, what we're trying to do is take that fresh piece of fish and give you a more enhanced experience of it, allow you to really experience all the aspects that bring out the best in it. So this is far from being about manipulation. This is very much more about sensory enhancement. So the shape of taste. So we've talked about how color and taste and sound and taste. Now, there was a survey, or there was a kind of questionnaire out there where you had a list of 20 ingredients. Show of hands for people who kind of did that. Okay, small number of people. Well, that's good because we have a few things up here. So there's these 2 shapes. Professor, do you want to just explain the theory behind the 2 shapes?
So these 2 shapes are called Buba and Kiki. They were first called that in 1929, meaningless terms. And the question that's been asked in 80 countries now in the intervening 80 or 90 years is which shape, the round one on the right, the angular one on the left, would you associate with the word Buba? Which of the 2 shapes would you associate with the word Kiki instead? Okay. And wherever in the world you go, whoever you ask, no matter how young nor old, 98% or so will agree that Kiki has to be the shape on the left. It just feels right. It kind of goes well together. It seems natural. There's a correspondence there between speech sounds and shape. And on the right, Buba, maybe it's something about the way the words sound, the way it's written, or maybe those are correlated, but that just has to be the Buba on the right. And in 2006, 2007, at a Science Oxford, at an event much like this, when Heston and I were doing a demonstration, it was the first time I think we started saying, well, could we start adding tastes and flavors? Do they have shapes too? And if you just try it for yourself, we've got 5 different foods here, and probably intuitively, you just know what shape would go with each of those flavors.
So just a kind of quick run through, if you'll actually call out. So would rhubarb, tart, fresh rhubarb, would that be Buba or Kiki? Bananas, lemons, butter, strawberry jam. Ooh. Okay. What's quite interesting, though, is you start to realize that you can pretty much, for me as a chef, that was very interesting because I guess as chefs, we categorize ingredients in so many different ways. It could be proteins, fats, and carbs. It could be dry, fresh, fermented, or whatever it is. You have all these different ways of categorizing ingredients. But we thought it would be super cool to kind of categorize all the ingredients we could think of into Buba and Kiki. And then we developed this dish, being Buba and Kiki. So based on the colors, shapes, textures, that you see on the plates, let's say show of hands for your left hand being Buba or Kiki, or if you want to call out Buba or Kiki. Right. So without explaining to our diners, this was on the synesthesia menu as well, without explaining the whole concept behind Booba and Kiki to the diners, we would serve this plate, which we split down the middle to make a very kind of clear split between the two elements on the dish. We'd serve one half first, then we'd come around and serve the other half, and then we would ask them to begin with the side they felt was most Booba, and we pretty much matched the results of about 95 to 98% of people went with the left-hand side of the dish being Booba and the right being Kiki. So it's just very interesting to see as well, once we take these kind of ideas into a real-life dining setting and you have all the distractions of both your company, the environment, the service, and everything else going on around you, whether you still make or draw those same kind of conclusions.
And to what extent they change the taste of the food. And in certain circumstances, by changing simply the shape of the food, you can bring out sweetness or sourness or bitterness. But are those Booba and Kiki shapes the perfect ones? Kohler just drew them in 1929, perhaps giving them not much thought, and psychologists for the last 80 years have been using exactly the same shapes. But the two shapes we just showed you, are they the perfect representation of sweetness and sourness or bitterness? I think not. And again, it's back to the lab now, back to massive online research to say, could we optimize through crowdsourced data selection and evolutionary algorithms, the perfect shape in which to present something in order to distinguish each and every taste, and perhaps also flavor. And so
I guess it could be the shape of the. I guess it could be the shape of the plate,
and the shape of the plate, or the typeface on the menu, or even the table you're sitting at. We're wondering, does that have any subtle impact on your experience? So one thing that's come up a couple of times is this kind of idea of crowdsourcing data. That sometimes in Joseph's kitchen theory, wherever it happens to be localized, you can see how diners rearrange their jellies or which side of the plate they start when they go for Booba. But sometimes you want to do more stuff online instead. And here's just a dish to illustrate the approach from Albert Landgraf from a piece, one Michelin star restaurant in Sao Paulo in Brazil. A beautiful bit of gastro porn with 3 onions and tapioca spume or foam. You can ask the chef, why did you plate the dish in that orientation? Did you just throw things down? Is it random? And he'll say, no, I thought about it. It was important to me. I played with it, and eventually I just thought it was kind of right in that orientation. But that's an important judgment. Is it the right orientation? Because this is now the signature dish on his restaurant menu, and it's around the world on the internet, shared by hundreds, thousands, or even millions of people. You'd want to optimize, I think, the visual appearance of that food on the plate. So with Albert's permission, we can take his dish and then allow people on the internet just to spin the plate and say, imagine yourself going to Albert's restaurant tonight. This is the signature dish. How would you like it served? We're going to pay you 6 cents, whatever you say. So maybe you just press the button as fast as you can and get it over with and get your credit. But in fact, people aren't like that, by and large. We find that people do care about the orientation in which their food is presented, and that within an hour, even in some cases a few minutes of putting that dish on the internet, we'll have a couple of hundred potential diners responding, each dot a diner. And if we wait till the next morning, or we go to the Science Museum in London and have maybe 50,000 people spinning the plate into their preferred orientation, we can find, in this case at least, the chef was almost right. He put it at 12 o'clock, 2,200 people, their preferred orientation is 3.4 degrees past 12 o'clock. Close enough for the chef not to care. But at least he can sleep better knowing that his intuitions have been backed up by large-scale, rapid data collection. So when somebody like Joseph is thinking about a new dish on the menu for the next concept, whatever that might be, maybe it's a langoustine with some chili oil and tofu, and who knows what else is on that plate, he might initially think, well, I've got the ingredients right. Maybe I'm thinking this is the way to plate it. And in some of our work in trying to think, we don't just crowdsource the data and then, wow, that's what people think. One tries to look in the literature, from brain science, from aesthetics literature, what kind of predictions you might make about preferred orientations and why. Sometimes those ideas will come from the science journals and the study of visual arts. Sometimes, like in this case, if you analyze the work of Kandinsky, an inspiration for some of the dishes that we've been working on, you'll find this kind of dominance of ascending to the right lines. There's maybe an evolutionary story about why that kind of orientation might be preferred on the canvas that just so happens to be round. But if we take Joseph's dish, allow people to spin the plate online in the Science Museum, in the lab or elsewhere, we'll find that this is the preferred orientation and kind of have a sort of theoretical explanation for why that might be. And maybe the key thing is it's not constraining the chef's creativity. They've come up with the ingredients and the combination. It's just sort of optimizing the presentation through rapid, cheap crowdsourced data collection.
And so we had this dish which was called A Taste of Nature that was on our Nordic menu, and we wanted to figure out what the best way of plating it was. You know, as all of you, I'm sure, over time have seen on Instagram, at one point everyone was throwing everything to one half of the dish and calling it asymmetric plating. So we thought, hey, you know, is that more appetizing? Do people prefer to see things all kind of on one half of the dish? So we put these two. Well, there was two things that we did with these. First of all, there was the rotation. As you can see, if you don't have kind of like a very strong linear element on the dish, people didn't really seem to care which angle you plated it or you served it at. And when you do have that kind of line, all of a sudden it became there's much more of an opinion on which direction it should be in. But what I found really interesting about this as well is we asked people which they found more appetizing, and people generally found the one on the right to be more appetizing. And then the interesting question is, which would you pay more for? And they'd actually pay more for the one on the left. So it's very interesting to see the difference between what people actually find appetizing versus maybe you'd pay a little bit more because that looks maybe more artistic to them, or maybe it looks a bit more kind of modernist or something in its presentation. So, and that gives it kind of an added value in some way.
And so for the last of the kind of the four examples of how research starts in the science lab and goes to the kitchen and back again, or starts in the kitchen, goes to the science lab and online, and then back to the restaurant, here's the kind of the latest idea that the chef and the scientist have been sort of working on. And it just comes from my undergraduate lectures I give to students in Oxford about mental imagery and visual perception. And just a couple of examples of things that we know about visual perception, and the question is, do they translate onto the plate, into the mouth, onto the palate of the diner? So here we've got Necker cube, famous symbol drawn by a Swiss chemist in 1832, Ernst Necker. And if you look at the one on the left, it's used a lot in vision perception research because as you stare at it, something strange will start to happen in that sometimes this corner will poke out of the front of the page and this one will go to the back, but sometimes it will reverse back and forth. And if I had a stopwatch and I had you in the lab or even online, I could measure that on average, once that shape starts to switch back and forth between two interpretations, it will switch every 2.8 seconds or so. And this is kind of used as an example of your brain trying to create with multiple possible interpretations what's out there in the world. And it's kind of an example of switching. The Necker cube switches, and there are many other examples of visual illusions, auditory illusions, touch illusions that switch. Your perceptual experience goes from one thing to another, back and forth, the duck and the rabbit, so on and so forth. And the question is, could you ever serve that on the plate in a dish whose flavor flipped back and forth in a predictable manner? I think not. We haven't. Well, that's the kind of challenge at the moment. I say this is what we know about vision, hearing, and touch. Can you find that in the plate? Because I've never seen it there. And are there reasons why taste and flavor might be different in kind from the kind of switches you get in hearing and vision? Maybe what you see more often on the plate or in the glass is something like this. This is an example of emergence, another classic visual illusion or effect from the Gestalt psychologists. What initially to most people will just look like a black and white dot, meaningless sprinkling of black and white dots. But as you stare, then hopefully you'll see what's in the image. You'll see the Dalmatian dog with its kind of nose to the ground. Here it's black ear, one leg, and the other legs at the back. So a Dalmatian dog pointing away, sniffing the ground in a field of leaves. And once you see that, once that dog emerges, it doesn't emerge in parts. You don't start saying, oh yeah, there's an ear. It sort of comes at you all at once. It emerges. And once you've seen the dog in the image, you can never unsee it. And if I were to show you this image 5, 10, 15 years later, as soon as you saw it, it's a dog. You cannot undo your perceptual construction. We know about this in vision, and the question is, does the same thing happen when you're sipping a glass of wine or when you're trying to determine what the flavors are in a dish or not? And so my sort of challenge to Joseph a few months ago was, okay, we know about this in vision. Is there an example, a nice way to demonstrate, illustrate this to the diners at Kitchen Theory through their taste buds?
So we came up with a dish called Every Act of Creation Begins with an Act of Destruction, and this was a quote by Pablo Picasso, and he was talking about it more on a creative plane, like if you want to be really creative, you've got to destroy old ideas and start on a new plane. But I thought, well, as chefs, we're constantly destroying things in the kitchen. So the main feature on this dish are two ingredients, duck and beetroot. Now, if I brought a live duck and a raw beetroot into the dining room, I don't think my guests would be find that overly appetizing. So we have to take those two beautiful ingredients, kill the duck, destroy them, and then recreate them into something that they find both appetizing and satiating and that tastes great. So we tend to give that very kind of brief explanation to our guests just before we serve this dish. And then just before the hostess will leave the table, she'll say, but I'm afraid we're having a bit of a technical issue in the kitchen because the chefs are still quite literally trying to catch the duck. And at that point, you start hearing over the loudspeakers a whack, 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 whack. And there's a kind of, you've gone from this idea of, oh no, there's going to be a delay, there's a problem, to, ah ha ha, there's laughter. And we wanted to evoke laughter in people. We wanted people laughing at our dining table. And then it kind of goes whack, 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 and you hear, and it gets a bit more kind of agitated, whack, whack, until boom, you hear the cleaver come down, and the duck has been killed. And then all of a sudden, it's gone from laughter to, they just played a duck being killed. And maybe a lot of people aren't expecting that when you go to a dining experience. I'm not doing it to shock people or to kind of, gross them out in any way. The whole point that we're getting to is you've got chefs all over the world now talking about let's say the beef, where it came from, what the cow's name was, what its last meal was, and we're going into excruciating detail about it. I'm just showing you another step in the process, which is how it gets slaughtered. And the point is, if you feel that bad about it, about hearing that, you probably shouldn't be eating the duck in the first place. And to answer any questions, do we have vegetarians that have an issue with this? No, because I think they appreciate the message that we're putting out there. But to kind of bring this all back together, we ask people then, because this comes back to what Professor Spence was talking about here, and it's about this idea of emergence, and we ask people, can you see the face in the dish? And this is how we would serve the dish normally. Anyone seen a face in there? All right, show of hands. 1, 2, 3, okay, 4, okay, few people. So usually we do very small numbers of people at our dinners. When we were running this last, there was about 18 diners, and of the 18 diners, you might have one that kind of got it. So then what we would ask them to do is look at the image, look at the dish of the person in front of them. So that means you're looking at it inverted. Now, can we see a face? Show of hands for who can. Okay, few more people. Good. Can we go to the next? Now can we see a face? Show of hands. Okay, many more. Perfect. So and anyone recognize who? Pablo Picasso. So it's this idea of kind of taking the dish full circle, and one of the kind of main kind of ideas behind this is kind of drawing that comparison between art and gastronomy and saying that, taste and gastronomy, like art, is all a matter of perspective and how you're looking at the dish. And we want people, when we talk about multisensory flavor perception, we don't want to be distracting people from what's on the dish with kind of, or we do use things like dry ice and projections and lighting. We use those kind of tools, but at the end of the day, we use them to enhance their perception of what is on the plate rather than distract them from it.
Okay. And thank you very much.
Thank you.